When we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people...
Thank you again for joining us for this year's 27th annual African American and Caribbean Studies Summer Institute, hosted by the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. And I would like to thank you that you're joining me for this particular session. And this session is entitled Centering the Voices and Contributions of Black People in World History. And just kind of follow along as we discuss how do we center, why do we center, and what is the impact and what is the whole purpose around making sure that we center the voices, the experiences, the contributions of Black people in the entire scope of world history. So the Eurocentric school of thought focuses primarily on the contributions and the experiences of European people during major historical events. Usually what we see in traditional curriculums and traditional textbooks and even within traditional narratives is that we see a single story. We see the experiences of one specific group of people and how it impacted them. And we see the cause and effect of a certain historical events as it impacted primarily European people. And that's called Eurocentrism. So the aim of this session is to dismantle this way of thinking, right? This perception that we have, and create a dispositional shift where participants and anyone who joins us today, that we can start to at least start to transform the way that we think and we view world history, where we start to develop a way of examining history that involves centering the voices, the experiences and contributions of all people who were impacted by specific historical events. But this particular presentation will focus on the voices and contributions of Black people in this microcosm that we know as world civilization, where we've impacted, where we've contributed, and where we have played a major integral role in a lot of events throughout world history. But we know we've been taken out of history. We know our stories have been erased, our stories have been marginalized, our stories have been put within these parameters and these boxes which hold no academic integrity. We start and also has no historical accuracy. And I love it's music, and I love musicians and our artists. And when it comes to our artists and how musicians think and in some places how they articulate the experiences of Black people. So one of these people is a legendary poet and artist, and I would even say one of the forefathers and pioneers of what we know as hip hop culture would be Gil Scott. And one of his poems called His Story.
I was wondering about our yesterdays and digging through the rubble. And to say the least, somebody went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that when we looked things up, we wouldn't fare too well. And we would come up with totally unreliable pictures of ourselves.
And what Heron says here, he says a lot, and it's a lot to unpack here. And what he's saying is that somewhere in history, someone has been through a hell of a lot of trouble and have made a concerted effort to make sure that our history, and when we say our history of Black people, have been virtually erased, or even when our history is spoken of brought within the whole narrative of world history, that our story or our history is not told with accuracy, that does not glorify us, that the story does not show the full accuracy and the full capacity and propensity of African people, and just the value that we've brought to human civilization. As I said, as I say many times, when we always kind of think about where is the starting point to talk about the history of African people, the starting point of African people will be the very beginning of human civilization, as we are progenitors and we are major contributors to the development of what we know as civilization and society. So before I went into this presentation, what I wanted to do is, what I did is I looked through traditional curriculums, and I looked through some atlases of world history, and even Googled some websites and kind of looked up what are the major historical events in world history, right? So generally across the consensus of what I found in most traditional curriculums is a framework that looks a lot like this, right? Well, we have this Eurocentric framework of history. So what I did here is, like, first of all, in the center of this particular slide is that we visualize what history what history looks like based on this framework. As we see the European continent enlarged right in the middle of this scope and this way of thinking. And we see other continents or other geographic regions kind of sitting there as outliers in the world, in the framework of world history. And one of the things that I did specifically and very purposely is that you look at the bottom of the scope and you see Africa, and Africa is almost not even within a circle. It almost sits outside of the circle. Because what happens is traditional frameworks of history, usually in some cases, Africa almost doesn't exist. So as what I did is I did extensive research, and I found major historical events throughout history, right? And as you look on this list of events, you see all of these events starting from the agricultural revolution, when humans start to domesticate plants and animals, through the rise and fall of the ancient Roman civilization, and the rise and fall of ancient Greek civilization, etc. And you see these major events, but very little, or even there's any existence of Africa in any of these major events. And another thing that I did is make sure that we just kind of visualize when we say Eurocentrism, and how traditional curriculum and traditional narratives usually leaves out or omits the story, and it places preeminence on European contributions. As I highlighted in red, as I put text in red of those events that directly came from the European continent, the continent of Europe. And as we see, we leave very, very little room to discuss or expound or dissect or analyze the historical contributions of other people outside of the European continent. Now, I must note that there is an amazing history, and there's an amazing story that can be told by people of European descent and of the European continent, and there have been some major and powerful contributions that have been made by Europe. But we must always remember that, as I can say the same thing about Europe, I can say the same thing about elsewhere in other parts of the world. The whole purpose of this is not to take away from the narrative, but we must correct the narrative by adding to the narrative that we present a more balanced perspective of historical events and just how our civilization and our society came into fruition. So the thing is here is that we approach curriculum, and we understand that this is problematic when we look at, and I'm going to go back a slide. It's problematic when we look at world history from this perspective of within this framework for many reasons. And as we go through this presentation, we're going to kind of get digging more into the why and why, and also discuss why our job as educators, it is important that, first of all, we provide our students and our children with full historical accuracy, but also we make sure that we maintain academic integrity by telling the full story, and we make sure within those stories that there were other people involved, that we have integrity by mentioning their experiences and how certain historical events played out and how it impacted individual people. So one of the things that we do within the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies is that we take an approach to various approaches to multicultural curriculum reform. And this is predicated on Dr. James Banks' model. And last year, during our 26th annual Summer Institute, we had the honor of having Dr. James Banks be here to articulate that. So you can still go on the same very YouTube channel that you're watching this, and you can see Dr. James Bake's presentation on his approaches to multicultural curriculum reform. So looking at the levels of integration and based on this model, right, we have four approaches. The contributions approach, which is very basic representation of people. The additive approach, where we still maintain that same framework that we saw in that last slide, but what we do is that we add to it, right? Then transformative approach, what we'll speak about later in the subsequent slides, is an approach where we take the curriculum, we tear down the curriculum and rebuild it in a way that it naturally embeds or infuses the contributions, the perspectives, and the experiences of all people who are directly involved in those events, and sometimes people who are indirectly involved in events or were impacted by certain things that happened in history. And I put next to here in this chart is that as a school district of Palm Beach County, and pretty much at any school district throughout our country, that we should have a desired approach for our content to at least meet that third approach, which is the transformative approach based on Dr. James Bake's model here. And one of the also desired approaches for content and also instructional strategy is a social action approach. It's when we take learning and make it relevant by allowing students to use their voice to take what they're learning to create change in society, which we'll discuss later in this presentation. So the transformative approach as a desired approach in our school district. And I just want to kind of dig a little bit deeper within that approach. So what happens in the transformative approach is this approach that changes the structure of the curriculum and encourages students to view concepts, issues, and themes and problems from several ethnic perspectives and points of view. This type of instruction involves critical thinking, right? And this is something that we want to encourage. We need to shift away from just the process of regurgitating information, of teaching students exactly what to think, but we want to create students who are critical thinkers, who are analyzers, and we want to teach the thought process and how to think. And we want them to be able to problem solve and create solutions based off of the things that they're learning. And this also considers, and this approach also involves consideration of diversity as a basic premise. So we must understand that there's no way to critically think, or no way we can find solutions from a single narrative, but we must understand and embrace diversity, not only racial and ethnic diversity, but also diversity in our thought processes. But to achieve this in our curriculum, we must take some following steps. And some of these steps are going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. It's going to create a dispositional shift in a lot of ways. And it's going to take on a whole new form and a whole new way of thinking and approach when we approach just society as itself and the lens that we look at things within society. So first, we must abandon Eurocentrism. We must abandon the idea of European preeminence. We must abandon sexism in our curriculum and within our approach. When we have an approach of misogyny, we have an approach that we marginalize the contributions of women within our curriculum. We must abandon Eurocentrism, sexism, and also homophobia. So even within the histories, and when you kind of break down the subsections of history, of African history, African American history, we have a habit of marginalizing women and also marginalizing individuals from the LGBTQ plus community. All right, we want to make sure we have a truly diverse and balanced perspectives of things that intersects across all ways of existing in society. And also, we want to develop an insight of history and culture of historically marginalized people. Example, Black and Latinx. And when I say insight in history and culture, we must not look at these groups, and we say these groups, Black and Latinx, as homogenous groups, and understand that there is so much diversity. And an example of that is, like when we say Black and Latinx, is that sometimes those two groups are inseparable. That people who are Latinx are people of African descent. So you have so much diversity within those groups. So we have a habit of just kind of lumping and just looking at groups as monoliths. But we must understand that there's so much diversity within these groups of people and all groups of people. Like, for example, we're right now talking about making sure that we bring the historical contributions of Asian Americans to the forefront. Asia is the largest continent in the entire world. So when we say Asian people, what are we saying? Are we talking about people from China and Korea, all the way back to India, even people in the modern day country of Palestine and Israel, and what we know as Southwest Asia or the modern Middle East. So we're looking at huge diversity, even when we use the term Asian American in this context. Also, we want to center the voices of people, of all people, involved in historical events and eras, and move away from a single story narrative. Not all world history impacted or was birthed from European people or Western European perspectives. We must understand that throughout history, well, I'm going to walk you through several examples throughout history, that we have a lot of major events that happen where you can center the voices of so many different people, so many racial groups, ethnic groups, and also gender groups as well. So the results of this should be a seamless fusion of content that equally represents multiple experiences, values, and points of view. So if we take on a transformative framework of history, we go back and we look at this model. So this model should turn to this model, where all contributions are centered within a framework. So when we visualize it, we see equal representation of all groups. In addition to, you have a much more diverse and a much more dynamic story versus just those small representation of historical events. And again, just like I say, we're not talking about taking away, or we're talking about adding to. So as our students and as our children learn about the rise and fall of ancient Rome, for example, they learn that right next to the rise and fall of Kush, or the rise and fall of Aksum, which were major empires in Africa at one point. And these were not only just major empires, but these are major empires that played a huge role in human civilization and a huge role in the development of history. And as we talk about other major events like the rise and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the age of exploration, as we talk about the age of exploration, we look at age of exploration right next to Abu Bakr II, who was a West African who sailed to what we know as present-day South America, followed by Christopher Columbus' arrival in the West Indies in 1492. Those are events did happen. Our students should learn about all of these things, but we should learn about these events with academic integrity and with historical accuracy. As we talk about the French Revolution, we should talk about the Haitian Revolution right next to that event. So we're not talking about taking away from events. We're not talking about excluding somebody else's story, which has happened to all other people when we approach things from a Eurocentric perspective, where we're talking about creating a whole story that includes the contributions and experiences of other people as well. So before we get started, there's a concept that we got to explore: acquisition and disposition. As we acquire knowledge, that we have to displace certain thoughts and certain thought processes that we had prior. So I've said this in various presentations. It's a concept of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that concept when we have new conversations, we come across new knowledge that doesn't fit within our old framework, how we become uncomfortable. And the literal definition of cognitive dissonance is a state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially relating to behavior decisions and attitude change. Example, rejecting new information that conflicts with our existing beliefs. That's called discomfort. When you have an existing belief that has been conditioned and indoctrinated in our way of thinking and existing and being, but now we have this new information that is inconsistent to that makes us question everything that we've learned before. And when we talk about approaching history, there's a lot of unlearning that we have to do so we can begin the process of relearning. So when I say that process of relearning, there's a concept known as cognitive reframing. And that's a technique, basically, when you identify and you change the situation and experiencing events in how new ideas are viewed. So pretty much you have this cognitive dissonance when you run into this new information that doesn't fit within your framework, but now you create a new framework by cognitive reframing. So what happens in this process is that new knowledge is no longer infused with the current knowledge, the current thought process. But it leads to a whole reconstruction of how we think and how we view the world and how we view history, specifically pertaining to this particular presentation. So as educators, we have the responsibility, right, to make sure that we first of all, we acquire new knowledge and we take a disposition so we can do what's best by our children, all of our children. So we must shift the instruction approach from the recollection of historical events, dates, etc., to social reconstructionism, where students and teachers partner together to address social questions and create a better society. We must kind of shift away from the selected response assessment when I just remember a whole bunch of historical dates and so forth. But the reason why we study history, the reason why we learn history, is that we look at our past and we can rebuild, so we can build a positive future. There are certain events that are happened in the past that we must address, that we must speak on, we must have conversations about. And some of these events are dark and very despondent events that occurred in history. But the purpose of it is not to stay within an event. The purpose of it is not to stay there so we can just pick apart and just kind of beat a dead horse. But the purpose of it is that we don't repeat the same mistakes moving forward in our future. So why should we transform curriculum and center Black voices, right? First of all, it creates a counter narrative. All right, and what does that mean when I say it creates a counter narrative? Throughout history, unfortunately, there has been a great deal of concerted effort to make sure that in all branches, not just history, within science, within all the social sciences, and you can find numerous examples of when Europeans have made a concerted effort to dehumanize people of African descent and to justify oppression and to justify institutions such as slavery. But the purpose of that, we must transform the curriculum, center on Black voices, and bring humanity to Black people, is that we can create a counter narrative to that. As there has been so much work and so much great deal of work to make sure we dehumanize people of African descent and Black people, we must make sure we put forth those same efforts to humanize people of African descent as well. By centering the history and culture, it enables Black students to cultivate their indigenous agency. As educators, our responsibility is not to do what? Our responsibility is not to empower students. We can't empower students. We can't give students something that they already have. There was Black brilliance, there was excellence, there was a lot of radiance, and there's a lot of things and a lot of gifts that are indigenous to Black children. And by allowing Black children to see a history of ancestors who have done great things throughout history and to understand that they stand on their shoulders, that allows Black students to cultivate and allow Black students to tap into that indigenous agency and power. It affirms the humanity of Black students so they can identify their place in society. Just like I said again, there's been a great deal of effort and work throughout history, like Gil Scott here, and somebody went through a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that we dehumanize Black people. So Black students now should be able to find a place where they fit in society. We wonder why Black students in a lot of cases disengage, because we don't see the relevancy of what we're learning. We don't see where we are within the learning process. And ultimately, if we don't see where we are within the educational process, I can't see where I fit in society. Also, it serves as a window and allows others to understand the richly textured history and diverse experiences of Black people. We can start to dismantle individual acts of racism known as bigotry. We have an opportunity when their Black students their Black students can be seen by other students that come from different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds as an equal. And it also takes away from, when I say diverse experiences, from the concept of stereotyping when Blacks are all viewed as one monolith. Also, it is impossible to address most social questions, especially that occur right here in the United States, without centering the injustices committed against Black people, right? There's a whole concept known as anti-Blackness, and there's a whole concept known as anti-racism. Anti-racism is the broader scope. And when we talk about anti-Blackness, we would see that racism has its roots within anti-Blackness. As we know that race is a social construct that was eventually developed to justify the enslavement of Black people. So it's impossible to deal with some of the issues and some of the inequalities that exist within our society without looking at some of the injustices committed against Black people. This is not to guilt anybody. This is all, as we must understand it, we all belong to the same human family. And as members of the human family, any injustice served to any of us should impact all of us. So we should not look at events and look at the injustices committed as to groups of people as isolated events that only directly impacts them, but it should inadvertently also directly impact other people as well, as we're part of the same human family, as we share the same fabric of society. So our topics of discussion today is I bring some examples of how do we center Black people within this whole microcosm known as world history or world civilization. And there are numerous examples, and those examples, we can go all day, we can go for hours. So I'm just going to bring 3 examples to today's discussion. Africa's contributions to civilization, the development of the Americas economically and culturally, and also the event known as World War II. Some of those examples that I'm going to bring to the forefront as how we can center and use as examples of how we can center the history and culture of Black people. So first of all, when we say Africa, it bothers me to look at traditional narratives that completely marginalizes or omits Africa from world civilization. And it's unfortunately that I've even heard from the mouths of some of our educators. I'm not going to call out anybody specifically. All right, so don't get afraid if you're watching, and this may be you, and it's okay. All right, that in some of our world history courses that we have educators who feel like we can opt out of teaching about history within world history, with African history or world history, right? And that bothers me because Africa made a huge contribution to civilization, and to leave that out is leaving out the foundations of world history, and it's leaving out a lot of major foundations and of the entire historical narrative of humanity. First of all, Africa is a cradle of humanity. We know the earliest human ancestor was actually Australopithecus, which was discovered in the Horn of Africa, which would be a modern day Ethiopia, Somalia. Also, we know that the earliest migrations of humans actually stem from the African continent, and we see the population and populations increase on different parts of our planet based off of the migration of humans leaving the African continent. We know that the invention of paper, papyrus, was developed in Kemet, which is also known in Egypt, during the 3rd millennium BC. One of the earliest forms of the alphabet was found in the African continent, and we know that was developed in northeastern Africa, the Nile River Valley of Kemet, Egypt, around 1800 BC. The earliest art, or a form of art that was ever discovered in human history, was found in Africa, in what we know as South Africa, and that dates back to almost 80,000 years ago. The earliest form of mathematics or any kind of measurement or counting was something that was actually discovered and found in Africa. It was something called the Nshango bone, which was discovered in the present day country that we know as the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it dated back 20,000 years ago. In medicine, for example, Imhotep from ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt was considered the founder of medicine during the 27th century BCE. So you even go to look at some of the scholars and some of the great men and women who made contributions to Greek civilization, who writes directly about those Black people from Kemet who had a profound influence upon their fields of study and around their development of society and civilization. And when it comes to scholarship, and when it comes to medicine and science and so forth, you see an influence that comes from the African continent. So to completely omit Africa, we want to completely omit a complete chunk of history without this, if we just don't discuss the things that Africa has done throughout history. And another example throughout in history, so in some of the contributions of African history, is that in Western Africa, you had 3 major empires. And Western Africa is going to be the earliest link to African people of the African diaspora who exist right here in the Western Hemisphere, would be Western and Central Africa. Most of the people during the largest forced migration in human history, known as slavery, will come from Western Africa and Central Africa. But at one point, there was 3 major empires or kingdoms that existed in Western Africa, known as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Ghana existed around 300 to around 1235. Then we got Mali from about 1230 to around 1600. And we see the largest geographic empire in West Africa, known as the Songhai Empire, from 1500 to around the 17th century or the 1600s. And I mention these because they made a huge contribution to what we know as global history. And here are a few details. First of all, one of the first universities that existed in human history was University of Timbuktu. It was established in the 12th century or the 1100s. It consisted of 3 mosques. So we must understand the University of Timbuktu does not take on the same context, or it is not going to be the same model of a university that we know right now in modern history. But more so, it was a loose federation of 3 mosques, or 3 learning centers that were referred to as a university. So you had several independent schools that taught subjects such as medicine, surgery, astronomy, cartography, chemistry, philosophy, history, art, anthropology, anatomy, and various other subjects. Matter of fact, it was known that the Timbuktu manuscripts of the library in the universities in Timbuktu had a collection of over 700,000 manuscripts or books, which were written and published by authors of African descent. Then we go to Mali. And we know that Mali was founded by Malinke Sunjata Keita, which is known as the Lion Prince or Lion King. It became one of the wealthiest empires in the entire world, and it controlled trade routes between the Sahara and also the Arab world, Europe and Asia at one point, when they controlled what we know as the gold, the salt trade, and they traded in gold and other precious minerals. And also, we must understand, because we always look at like the Magna Carta, which was signed in Europe at one point as the first charter of human rights, or the first charter that creates a constitutional government which curbed the power of monarchies. And this is not necessarily true, because one of the world's first constitutions, a charter for human rights, was known as the Manda Charter, which gave equal rights to women and slaves in some cases. It promoted cultural diversity, stability, peace, and access to public education, and created freedom. And one of the things that was unique about this one, in contrast to the Magna Carta, is the Mandan Charter was due through the Afrocentric and traditions of African people. It was passed down orally. So there was the griots of Western Africa that know the Mandan Charter by heart and by memorization to today. What happened in a lot of African history, a lot of the history was passed down orally. It wasn't in writing in some cases. So therefore, but with it not being in writing, sometimes historians like to kind of marginalize the history as if it's not accurate. Sometimes when we look at history and we look at events, we not always look at events in history by a Western European measuring stick, not by the norms of Western Europeans, but we must look at the norms of the people that we're studying to fully understand and capture the essence of what happened and what was experienced by those groups of people. So now we're moving into the development of the Americas, or Western Hemisphere, right? So when we talk about the development of the Americas, or the Western Hemisphere, it's kind of impossible to even have that conversation without censoring African people or Black people. It's impossible to have that conversation without centering us, because we've made such a huge impact by shared numbers, and just culturally, and just the impact that we made totally to the development of Americas is more than understated. And that's an understatement to say this understated, because there are so much things that we've done to the development, for the development, economically, culturally, politically, through the entire Western Hemisphere, that there is absolutely no academic integrity if you leave out our stories, and even decenter our stories from this narrative. So first of all, you look at this map here, and we say the development of Americas is strongly going to be predicated, unfortunately, on this institution that we know as slavery, or the transatlantic slave trade. So we look at these numbers here. We look at this chart here, right? So this chart here will also justify some of the numbers that I'm going to kind of discuss moving forward. As we know, that the transatlantic slave trade kind of took place roughly around the end of the 15th century, the 1400s, the late 1400s, all the way to maybe going into the 1900s or 1800s. I'm sorry, going into the 19th century. And we know, we look at these numbers and we look at migration patterns of just the diaspora as a whole, as we know the transatlantic slave wasn't the first African slave trade, but we look at the transatlantic slave trade specifically on this chart, and we look at just the sheer number of African people who are brought to South America, the Caribbean, and Middle America, even in contrast to the United States, because we inaccurately understand or have a complete misunderstanding even of that hard history that we know of slavery. And we think slavery as people of the United States and as Americans as only uniquely an American institution, without understanding that the development of the Americas itself was predicated on the enslavement of African people. So we look at the importation of Africans, for example, into the Western Hemisphere, that 96 to maybe 95% of Africans who were brought here to be exploited for slave labor were brought into South America and the Caribbean. Matter of fact, if I give you an example, the region that we know as Bahia, Salvador, Bahia in Brazil, imported more Africans in that one single region of Brazil than the entire United States throughout their entire history of slavery in the United States when we talk about the importation of Africans. So we got sheer numbers, we got huge numbers of African people who exist outside of the United States. And this right here is going to be a direct link to why I say that we played such an integral part in the development of the Americas. And we're going to have to kind of talk about history and some of those hard topics that we're trying to currently avoid talking about in our classrooms. Like, for example, the development of the Americas and the sugar economy were huge when we talk about why we were brought here. So between 1492 and 1776, there were almost 7 million people across the Atlantic Ocean and settled in what we know as the Americas. Over 80% of those people were African. All right, first of all, just look at those numbers. More than half of those people were enslaved on what we know as sugar plantations. So sometimes when we think about slavery, we think about it within the context of the United States, cotton plantations, rice fields in South Carolina, etc., and tobacco fields in Virginia. But we must think outside of that and understand that most of the Africans who were brought here to work on sugar plantations, which were known as white gold. All right, so during the 16th and 17th century, Brazil led an entire production, and it was only surpassed by the island of Haiti in the 18th century. And we know that for a while, Haiti was the largest importer or producer of sugar until the successful Haitian Revolution that sparked in 1791, which resulted in the independence nation, the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, the second free republic in the hemisphere, known as the island of Haiti in 1804. So by the mid-18th century, nearly half of the traffic in a port that we know as New Orleans, presently Louisiana, were headed to or from the Caribbean, importing sugar and enslaved people or enslaved Africans. At one point, Louisiana produced 1/4 or a quarter of the world's supply of sugar, and that was all based off the exploitation of labor of African people. So, first Prime Minister of what we know as Trinidad and Tobago was Eric Williams. And he said it best right here, economics of the Atlantic slave trade. When we talk about the entire economy of the Western Hemisphere was predicated on the free labor of African people, is that slavery was an economic institution of the first importance. It had been the basis of Greek economy, and it built up the Roman Empire. And in modern times, it provided sugar for the tea and coffee and cups of the Western world. It produced the cotton to serve as a base for modern capitalism. We're going to kind of dissect that a little bit more. When we talk about a free economy, a capitalism in the Western world, we must understand that the Europeans and even here in the United States had a direct benefit on the free labor of African people for hundreds of years. Go back to those sheer numbers when we talk about 80% of the people who were brought here to the Western Hemisphere across the Atlantic, who settled here in America, the Americas, were people of African descent. And what is sad and unfortunate about our story that we did not come here by choice. It was not by free will, but it was by force. The largest forced migration that ever existed in human history. was the transatlantic slave trade, which existed, just like I said again, from the late 1400s or going into the 15th century all the way to the 19th century. So when you talk about the Industrial Revolution and British industrialization and what we know as the Industrial Revolution, once again, is first of all, British ships transported an estimated 3 million Africans, all right? 3 million of us that were forcibly removed from the African continent were brought here directly by the British. So by the mid-18th century, annual exports from the Caribbean to Britain averaged around $350 million annually for unjusted inflation. And that was directly a result from free labor of African people. The Industrial Revolution, which is a process change from an agrarian economy, agricultural economy, to one that's dominated by industry and machine manufacturing, was one of those major turning points. So if you go back on that whole scope of events that occurred in major turning points throughout history, the first Industrial Revolution, which was centered out of Britain, was one of those events. And what's important to kind of add on that is that the profits produced by enslaved Africans, labor provided the capital for British industrial expansion. Matter of fact, the textiles were the dominant industry. And by 1860, we know that the British imported 90% of its cotton from the American South. Again, whose labor was that depended upon? Whose free labor was that dependent upon? So we have all of these things that we want to leave out of history, right? These aspects that we don't want to have conversations about. But these things are interwoven in the entire narrative of history. They're interwoven into the what fueled capitalism. They're interwoven and what built up and propped up economies in Western Europe, and also which would be known as the United States. So because of these sheer numbers and these huge numbers of African people, not only was the Western world or the Americas or even Western Europe kind of, were developed economically because of this free labor, but we got to look at the cultural influence that African people brought into the Americas. First of all, when you think about music, we think about the culinary arts, cooking and dance, art, literature, language, religion, and spiritual practices. To remove African people from that, it would be foolish, because it's not even possible, because of just the sheer influence and contributions of African people in the development of all of these cultural norms. When we look at African influence in Americas in music, for example, you wouldn't have reggae, wouldn't have dancehall, calypso, salsa, rumba, samba, merengue, bachata, compa, reggaeton, hip hop, spirituals, gospel, jazz, blues, eventually rock and roll, and all of these art forms that we enjoy today that we try to take away from African people, or to say that African people didn't contribute to. You wouldn't have that without the importation or the forced importation of African people in the Americas. We're interwoven in American society to a point that we should be centered when we talk about the history of the Americas, by centering their contributions of African people. We look at culinary, right? We look at all the different foods and the different cuisines that we enjoy in the Western Hemisphere would not be here without African people. Grain staples, things like mofongo, jambalaya, gumbo. We all know that certain foods and fruits and vegetables were the native to Africa, which were brought here, what we know as post-Columbian exchange, as watermelon, plantain, yams, black-eyed peas, coffee, okra, collards, callaloo, pigeon peas, and rice. What we know as stews and one-pot meals is something which is indigenous and natural to African people. Soul food, which is something that stems from African people who are brought here to the Southeast United States. Rice and peas. My favorite food, ackee and saltfish, jerk, barbecue. All of these different things that we enjoy, that we misappropriate, or we just don't give credit where credit is due to African people. We look at the United States economic development. In the pre-Civil War era, enslaved Africans were America's largest financial asset. Throughout different points in history, it fluctuated between 15 to 20% of total wealth represented in the United States were enslaved Africans. So between 1808 to 1835, cotton was the leading export here in the United States. And what was that dependent upon? The free labor of enslaved Africans once again. This impacted the shipping and financial industry. So sometimes we kind of consolidate that only the southern states benefited from slave labor, but which we know is absolutely not true, because you have other industries which were directly involved within the slave trade, which had huge benefits. Financial industries, because we must understand that most individuals who purchased enslaved Africans did not purchase those people outright. There were loans given out by banks. There were insurance companies that were involved to insure enslaved people. So some of those financial institutions resided right in the northern cities like New York, and even in Europe, places like London, who invested capital into plantation for purchasing land, purchasing equipment, and also enslaved people, enslaved Africans. The Bank of England, Lloyd's of London, the Barclays, HSBC, all financial institutions at some points throughout its history had a direct impact or direct benefit from enslaved Africans. Some of the New York City financial institutions, shipping and insurance companies received 40% of cotton profits. Like in New York Life, which is an insurance company, a financial institution, AIG, Aetna, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, some of those institutions that have some root within the transatlantic slave trade or the enslavement of African people. So as we see, we can't separate the telling those stories. Even though it's some ugly history, it's a history that must be taught, and it's a history that we must know so we can move forward. Also, now we're moving into World War II, which was the bloodiest conflict in world history, matter of fact, World War II. And I kind of went back and forth, and I just wanted to kind of keep this presentation under a certain time frame. So I went back and forth, and I wanted to talk about World War I and World War II, but I kind of just kept it within the parameters of the Second World War. And most historians would say that both wars were directly connected to each other, right? So I even know one historian, and just the name just slipped me, who even said that pretty much that the World War I and World War II was just one event, and the 1920s and the 1930s served as maybe a temporary peace treaty or just a break between the wars. But we must understand that when we talk about this history and just in events such as this one, that it's easily that you can center the experiences of people of African descent within this war. It's the largest military conflict in history. And one of the stories when we say who served in this war, first of all, over 1 million African Americans served in World War II. Over 1 million continental Africans served. And that's like one of those stories that are usually not talked about. Those Africans who are part of the colonial of European colonialism, who were forced to fight in World War II, but they made powerful contributions. And also, when we say the European colonies, we must understand that the British, for example, had huge colonies in the Caribbean, and we know the Caribbean Regiment, where over 10,000 blacks from the West Indies served in the British Armed Forces. And for example, the U.S. military was racially segregated, and African Americans were largely relegated to non-combat roles such as cooks, mechanics, construction, or supply. But one of the amazing things about the history of African people that I must add is, regardless of how much African people were forced into all of these systems of oppression, and where we were forced to either be marginalized or relegated to second-class citizenship in society, that we still made creative passageways, we still thrive, and we still made valuable contributions, right? Remember the whole thing about counter-narratives, right? So despite the oppression, despite everything, we still created passageways, and we still made huge contributions despite everything and all the external pressures that took place upon our communities. So let's kind of reframe World War II, for example. So the start of World War II usually kind of marked when, by 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, right? So usually historians kind of mark that as the starting point. But if you kind of go back technically, you will see the starting point of World War II actually started with the conflict in Africa, for example. In 1935, the Second Italo-Ethiopian or the Second Italo-Abyssinian War, which took place in 1935. There was the first one that took place in 1895 as the Italians attempted to colonize Ethiopia. But Italy was defeated by the Ethiopians on the Menelik II in the Battle of Adwa. So what happened on October 3rd, 1935, fascist leader Benito Mussolini of Italy invaded Ethiopia. And what happened is that this act of aggression represented this expansionist ambition, which we see Adolf Hitler, the Nazis in Germany eventually would replicate their expansion when they invaded Poland and absorbed Austria and so forth into the Third Reich and what we know as the Third German Empire. But we see that these ambitions of what we eventually would know as the Axis power, where test the strength of what we know as the League of Nations, which is the precursor of the United Nations, as a peacekeeping organization. So it was a way to kind of test some of those treaties that came out of the First War. And also it was to kind of test what was going to be the overall effectiveness as there's this new organization that stemmed after the First World War, known as the League of Nations. But we saw the League of Nations place almost no sanctions. It was ineffective with keeping peace. It was ineffective at stopping Italy, even when Haile Selassie I was pictured right here, of pleading to the League of Nations for assistance from the aggressions, the acts of aggression that were taking place in the Ethiopian Empire. When they actually sat back and had no response, it did nothing. And eventually these ideas and these things would inspire other powers to expand, which we'll eventually know as the onset of the Second World War, the bloodiest conflict in history. Now, despite blacks being relegated to cooks and mechanics and what we know as like almost non-combat roles, well, how did they contribute? And some of them is still, contributed and powerfully through combat roles through the war. But beyond that, there are so many stories. Because sometimes when we think about World War II and how African Americans contributed, we kind of just start and stop with the Tuskegee Airmen, who made huge contributions, no doubt. But this is only one story of many stories of African people during the Great War. For example, we got Doris Dory Miller. He was a hero at the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was actually the event that brought the United States into the war. And he manned the anti-aircraft machine gun without any kind of formal training of that event. You're talking about a war hero, someone who just kind of went out there with straight intuition, with intuitive ability to learn how to man an aircraft carrier to defend his country, even though his country had no love or defense of him and his people. The Tuskegee Airmen, and we know as the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Corps, so the AAC, which is a precursor of what we know as the Air Force. And even within the Tuskegee Airmen, when we talk about diversity, and remember there were 5 Haitians who were actually part of this particular group. And that story must be mentioned, right? Because that breaks apart just that monolith, and also it expands the story of African diaspora people beyond just African Americans or American people here in the United States. Also, we got what we know as the 761st Tank Battalion, or the Black Panthers, which was actually one of the most effective tank battalions during the war. We also know that, we were relegated to other roles outside of combat, but you look at the Red Ball Express, which was equally as effective in making a contribution to the war, where you had a truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces that were 80% manned by African Americans during the war, and they brought 12,000 tons of supplies every day to support the war effort, which eventually led to an Allied victory during the war. The Black Roses, we think about after the Executive Order 8802, which was pushed by Mary Buckler Bethune and also A. Philip Randolph, when the African Americans almost had the first march on Washington during the 1940s during the Roosevelt administration. Because what happened is that you had government contracts going to companies who did not either employ African Americans or companies that were not owned by African Americans. So what happened is that as a result of this executive order, because Roosevelt did not want a march on Washington, and to prevent that, he signed Executive Order 8802. What happened is that eventually opened the doors to over 1 million African Americans who entered the paid workforce And more than half of those were Black women, what we know as Black roses. So look it up, look all this information up. Even when it comes to our scientific ingenuity, Frederick Jones, for example, developed refrigeration equipment used to transport food and supplies and blood during the war. So you're talking about being able to get food and being able to transport blood that was used to save lives during the war. Was the whole refrigeration process and how we can transport all of these valuable commodities and things that we all needed during this time period was developed by Black men. It was Frederick Jones. And we also know the huge contribution of Dr. Charles Richard Drew, and who developed a system to separate plasma from blood, which revolutionized storage. So therefore, you can make blood transfusions possible based on his brilliant brother, scientist, African-American Dr. Charles Drew. So these are just some examples of where we take this one event through our history, World War II, and we can center the contributions of people, African diasporic people, of people of African descent, or simply put, Black people in this historical event. So as we wrap up, so we talk about the how. As a teacher, what are some of the pragmatic steps that you can take to make sure that you kind of help transform the curriculum? First of all, work outside of the textbook. I've not seen a textbook publisher yet who have centered these stories, who have presented a transformative curriculum. Supplement your instruction. For example, you have us, the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies, who have resources and so forth, which we can offer over. We also have other depository that we know as Blender, where there are tons of resources that can be used to supplement your instruction. And also, we're working real closely with our social sciences, secondary social studies, to make sure that we naturally start to embed these stories within our current curriculum, within our current curriculum framework. Also, one of the most powerful steps is educate yourself. Educate yourself on these topics. And some of the books that I would recommend as a start is one of the most concise, more just straightforward, just kind of overall books or reference books that you can have is a book called Before the Mayflower, History of Black America, the 6th edition, and that's going to be edited and written by Leron Bennett Jr. Another one book that kind of focused to African Americans here in the United States would be History of African Americans by John Hope Franklin. The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD by Chancellor Williams. A good reference book to use is the Encyclopedia of African American and Experience. It's a reference book by Kwame Anthony Apai or Henry Louis Gates as well. And there are various other books around all of these topics and issues that you can start to educate and build that knowledge and build your own capacity around teaching these topics to our students. And again, reach out for us, myself, Brian Knowles. I'm the manager of the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. We got Karen Jefferson, Fernandez Henry, and an amazing team that is here to support our educators and help build capacity through our workshops, through our direct support, through curriculum support, or whatever is needed to make sure that you can provide the best instruction that contains and sustains academic integrity for all of these students. And as I started with the quote, I'm going to end with the quote by one of my favorite historical figures, El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, is education is an important element in the struggle for human rights. It is the means to help our children and our people rediscover their identity and thereby increase their self-respect. Education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs only to the people who prepare for it today. So what Brother Malcolm or Brother El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz is saying here, that there's been so much that has been put into making sure that we dehumanize African people, that we're stripped of our self-respect and our dignity. But we must go back and rediscover our past so we can develop an identity where we have self-respect, that we understand that we stand on the shoulders of greatness. And these are great brothers and sisters who have done amazing things throughout history. And it is our job as educators that we not empower students, but we create an environment that allows students to feel empowered or be empowered. And not only just for the benefit of Black students, because this is our primary focus. You know, we have a thing that we must make sure that we have conversations that focuses in on specific groups of students and understanding that it's going to have a universal impact on all students. But we must understand also that that we must not benefit, but also bring self-respect, identity, and empowerment for Black students, but also allow other students to see others in a different light and in a positive light. So I thank you again that you all joined me for censoring the contributions of Black people in world history, looking at the whole microcosm that we know as world civilization and how we can center. There's so many more examples that we can bring forth, but just kind of stay with us throughout the year as we provide workshops and how to continue this work. And just remember that we're here to support this work and making sure that we create an educational environment that helps all students discover their empowerment. So we thank you again for joining us for the 27th Annual African American Latino Holocaust, 27th Annual African American and Caribbean Studies Summer Institute. Thank you again. Peace.